All right, welcome back to the Bat of Doom track here at Virtual KernelCon 2020. We're here with Joe Wilson, and Joe's talk today. I think it's perhaps not going to be quite as personal as the previous talk, but I think it's a pretty personal story, a narrative around some of Joe's history. And I'm really happy that Joe chose KernelCon and chose to even give this presentation at all. It's something he said he'd been thinking about for a while. And I think that it will connect and give people some insight as to how, I guess, Joe got to where he is today. And with that, I will pass it off to Joe.
Thanks, Tim, for the introductions. First, I'd like to say thoughts and prayers out to anyone who's affected by COVID-19. And also, I want to say thanks to the KernelCon staff. Fantastic in putting this together virtually. Well done across the board. As Tim said, I'm Joe Wilson. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at CSG. And I'm going to talk about biohack and how we can possibly look at integrative medicine principles to change the game in cybersecurity today. So with that, we'll get started. So let's level set on cybersecurity. As you all know, it's an exceedingly complex space that requires large investments across people, process, and technology. And those are all required to make a large impact on an organization. And here's where we sit as security pros. We often sit in the spin zone. So don't stare into the middle too long here. There is hope. But this can happen due to challenges you often face or have faced in your career. Perhaps it's technology bets that didn't pay off, or a lack of overall investment that you're experiencing, or a difficult political situation, or just a lack of overall expertise that you've got on your teams. And so this is where we sit often, but there is hope, as I mentioned earlier. So let's talk about how we get there. Well, how we bring hope into the situation is draw parallels from other equally or even more complex fields. In this case, I'm talking about healthcare. So let's consider some fundamental or alternative methods for solving the complex security issues we face. First, a little bit of background on my medical story. So my original college pathway was full steam ahead towards the medical sciences. I went so far as to pass organic chemistry and received a chemistry minor. Before doing a complete 180 and finding my true passion in information security. Adding additional fuel to the fire, I also married into medicine. And I'm still learning about new practices and advances in the industry, and enjoy picking the brain of my wife once in a while. So throughout this journey of exploring my passion for cybersecurity, and also retaining my curiosity with the medical field, I've noticed some fantastic similarities and opportunities for us to leverage in another exceedingly complex space, and in particular, patient wellness. What's interesting is both of my interests are driven by curiosity on how systems work. In the end, health and security involve machines, and those machines have inputs, outputs, variables, including vulnerabilities, natural defenses, etc. In order to have optimal performance on any of those machines, you've got to have that machine running in prime condition. As we'll discuss later, there are multiple factors that play a part in this process, and that's what I want to share with you today. So the journey to patient wellness comes in many forms, as I mentioned, but let's talk about what it can bring to the table in regards to patient wellness. There are two words that come to mind in our country's approach to health-related concerns as well as cybersecurity, and those two words are quick and fix. And keep in mind, those two words are often used in health-related concerns that may include nefarious disease states such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular issues, etc. How many times have we heard, take this pill and it'll fix your blood pressure, or have this procedure done and it'll fix it? And my favorite today is buy this CBD product from the Whole Foods market and everything will be fine. We also try to find quick fixes in the world of cybersecurity. Buy this firewall, it'll protect you. Our antivirus is the best in the world, and you'll be able to respond faster if you leverage our product. A lot of those things are stated, and in some ways, the medical community has come farther in the treatments of these conditions, present within the body and the overall approach to wellness. And you'll see below, I've got a definition of biohacking. And biohacking is a term that you can see in the medical field. It's actually growing. But basically what that is it's biological experimentation that's done by individuals and groups working outside a traditional medical or scientific research environment. And my encouragement to you is that you can be a biohacker in the cybersecurity field. So let's talk about that a little bit further. First, let's review the lengths in which the medical community has come. An early practice dating back to the time of the Egyptians was bloodletting. This approach was used to balance the most critical organs in the body, in particular the brain, the lung, the spleen, the gallbladder. However, centuries later, the medical community moved to the anecdotal trial and error approach and case-by-case doctrine. In other words, this worked for this dude or this lady, it should work for you. Not something that gives me huge comfort. As modern medicine matured and improved, clinical studies expanded, and the body of evidence was leveraged to both diagnose and treat ailments in order to achieve overall health. That's what's called, evidence-based medicine. You may hear that term today. But despite these approaches, these three, the medical professionals have identified that patient wellness is much more complex than originally conceived. And in this case, a more holistic approach is required and now has been recognized across the industry. And we'll talk about that approach here in a second. If I were to equate these three things in the computer security field, bloodletting might be the equivalent of our first connections to the internet and how we had wide open systems. The first goal of computers was to communicate and to successfully communicate. The whole idea and concept of security was not in place at that time. When you look at trial and error, I equate that to basic antivirus blocking or basic IP blacklists and whitelists. Sure, it would work for a short time until the bad guy figured out a way to work around it. And for the most part, we've moved into some evidence-based approaches, in my opinion. You look at frameworks and standards of care. The same is applied in the cybersecurity field. We've got frameworks of cybersecurity. You guys are familiar with PCI, you're familiar with HIPAA, you're familiar with those kinds of frameworks, including ISO, to go and secure your environments. But for the most part, we sit in this evidence-based space today. There is research that's ongoing. Does this prevent an attack, XYZ? And you've seen some product enhancements, but it's nowhere where it needs to be. So you might be asking, well, where does this need to go? And in my opinion, it needs to go to the biopsychosocial approach. This model is one that's defined and considers the biological, the psychological, and social factors and their complex interactions across the board to solve a health-related condition. In short form, this approach considers the whole person, the physical body, the mental state, what's going on with them socially, what's going on with the environment and habits, as well as other factors that may or may not be observed and play a part in wellness. And this was developed by a guy named George Engel, and his whole goal was to reverse the dehumanization of medicine and the disempowerment of patients. And often what happens in the medical field is the same thing that happens in cybersecurity. We have a symptom, we go and treat it. We have a symptom, we go and treat it. Someone might come in with a temperature at the doctor's office. They'll say, yeah, take some ibuprofen, go home, you're fine. But in reality, they come back a week later and it's worse and they're feeling even sicker. And they might have something like a cavity that's been infected and things like that, but it takes additional research to figure that out, to figure out what the core of the issue is. So what's the difference in the biopsychosocial model? The one thing that I think is critical for you to take away is it's both a philosophy of clinical care and a practical clinical guide. It's a way of understanding diseases and illnesses and how those things are affected by multiple levels of organization. And what's interesting about this is when you start reading the research that's out there, by some awesome physicians, in particular Boral Cario, and then you've got Anthony Suchman and Ronald Epstein, who talked about that this is such a different way, a different approach, because it takes the whole person into account and also looks at that person in a different way. So if you think about this as a total guide for care, and that's what we need in the cybersecurity field. So the 4 takeaways I'm hoping you have today from my talk is, 1, our cybersecurity patient is way more complex than we ever give credit to. 2, just like patient wellness, we need to be able to understand cybersecurity disease states and illness at multiple levels. Again, societal all the way down to molecular level. So that means the nitnoid details within your network, all the way to the interactions with your company, with other companies. A cybersecurity patient's, number 3, a cybersecurity patient's previous experience is an essential contributor to the accurate diagnosis. What I'm saying there is, and what these folks are saying, these awesome researchers, are basically stating that, hey, your past, it matters. And we'll talk about why that matters here in a few slides. But the security program that you may inherit, and we inherit as cybersecurity professionals, the past matters. And you may have some significant barriers of entry to move your cybersecurity program forward due to that. Number 4, cybersecurity programs are required for treatment. Just like health-related programs, we need to consider what we can do in the cybersecurity health and wellness space in regards to programs and treating the entire person, not just something that we look at on a simple checkbox state. This is much more complex than that. So let's talk about the biology component of this in cybersecurity wellness. When we talk about people, you have to consider what components you have to bear, right? This is probably the simplest part of the entire biopsychosocial process, because we're all familiar with this. This is what we navigate to in normal times. We talk about the types of resources we have. We talk about the organizational structure within people, processes, and technology. We talk about the training plans and the engagement model. All of these things from a biological component in cybersecurity really matter. In the process side, you have to think about how our process is created and maintained. What is the education, awareness, and training approach within that organization? Are those processes actually, are they manual or are they fully automated? What are the data types and regulations regarding the process side that you have to follow? Some folks have extreme data type concerns. It could be military information all the way to healthcare information. There's all kinds of regulations that have to be adhered to procedurally just because of the biologic makeup of that data that you're playing with. On the technology side, what is the ecosystem end to end? How is it maintained? Is there business logic involved across the board? So when you think about the biologic makeup, it is the normal things that we talk about on a day-to-day basis: servers, laptops, software, all of the people that we have in our organizations. I will tell you that this is still a struggle point for us in the cybersecurity space. SANS Top 20 control has been an asset inventory. And if you don't know the asset inventory in your enterprise, how can you possibly protect it? But it's still a struggling point for most organizations. And so this is the simplest part of biopsychosocial, and we're still not getting this right. So there's definitely room for improvement in the biologic component of cybersecurity. So let's talk about the psychology part, the psycho part of cybersecurity wellness. When we talk about people, there's a psychology component with how they are incentivized, how management, how they lead, what's their philosophy across the board with their people. It is an interesting point to look at how leadership responds in a time of crisis. How do they interact with their people across the board in those kinds of dire times? And there are psychological components that play a part in your security program when you start to think about it. Also, how do you manage poor performance within an organization? That says volumes about the organization. Whether or not you want to admit that, it's a different story. But if you're not managing poor performance, you're saying it's okay not to be proactive in the cybersecurity space. On the procedural side, when you think about the psycho component here, what is the punishment system for not adhering to the core policies or procedures that you have within your organization? Are those processes ad hoc or rigorous? And are policies easily changed, or is it really hard? If it's a 10-step process to actually change a procedure or a policy, oftentimes the psychology part of human interactions is going to avoid changing the policy or the procedure, even if it's the right thing to do. On the technology side, is an organization bleeding edge, leading edge, or archaic in their approaches? And what that can do, depending on the situation, and let's say it's an archaic approach, and leadership has said, hey, we're going to maintain our environment as long as possible and not spend very much money. What can definitely happen in that space is the employees that you have may stop giving suggestions on how to enhance the security of that organization. That's just one example. In regards to technology, another one is stability versus advancement. Is there a draconian approach to stability? Or is the leadership team and the business willing to accept some risk to make the significant changes that are needed to drive out technology in a secure fashion? Architecture and engineering is another one. But then another approach here is, in philosophy that's really important, is the business drive technology, or does technology drive the business? And what's important to note across the people, process, technology, in just this psychology part of this, of the biopsychosocial process, is that all of these three things, the people, process, technology, actually can influence each other. Same goes in the biology component. So this is a complex ecosystem that's way beyond what we normally give credit for. So these people, process, technology, all interact. It's all a complex ecosystem, and we have to be aware and understand that. When we talk about the last part, which is social, we really need to understand how our team communicates externally as well as internally with other security programs or third parties. Also, we've got to look at the relationships the CISO has invested in. We have to understand those. Are there key leaders in the organization that they lean on? Are they a trusted advisor for some other components that are extremely complex? That also goes into the psychology, that bounces back into the psychology part of this as well. On the people side, is there a larger committee involved in the information security program? And if so, how does that play a part in overall wellness? From a procedural perspective, are those standards socialized properly? We often, will evaluate the healthiness of a standard or a policy, but is the socialization of that policy ever measured and accounted for? In some cases, yes, that can happen with cybersecurity training, and that is considered a checkbox. But how often are those policies and standards updated and not shared out to an organization? That can be a key detriment across the board. On the process side as well, what do contract reviews and vendor management look like? Those are social aspects. You are interacting, your security program is interacting with those contractors, interacting with those vendors in a whole new world. For example, when's the last time you've asked your vendors in your space how their people are communicating with third parties and internally, and how are their people incentivized? That'd be an important question to ask a third party that's doing work on your behalf. Under the technology side, it's really important to know which systems are talking to other systems. Again, we are talking about a more complex space than we've ever had, and it's never going to get easier. But we need to understand those core systems, who they talk to, how long they're talking to, all the important data. Sounds a little bit like NetFlow, probably in some cases. But also from a technology perspective, what are your core customers? And how do you have to ensure maximum connectivity to those core customers? And then the last part I'll leave you with is on the social side, what AI is talking to your AI to enhance your AI? And it's an exceedingly complex space today. There's been advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning, but I think it's really important to know, especially going in the future, what part of your AI system is relying upon another AI system, and what kind of conversations are happening, and how do you mutually make sure that your AI is actually getting fed proper data from another AI system? I don't feel like we're that far away from that, and some of that's already occurring today. And so are you monitoring the social aspects of that within your enterprise? Do you have standard agreements set and SLAs across that? And so this is the social aspect of cybersecurity wellness, and I don't think this is measured very well. You're probably saying, well, so what? And here's my challenge to everyone today. I believe the biopsychosocial cyber wellness model is a great one to break down possible attack vectors, discuss strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, as well as threats across the board. You can take the last 3 slides I just presented and flip it on its head and say, well, how do I attack an internal employee within an organization? Well, hey, there's 3 things that play a part in that. There's a biologic, there's a psycho, and then there's a social component of that. And if I can influence any of those, I win. And so I think there's a bigger attack model that we need to consider going forward. The second bullet point here is cybersecurity patient treatment plans may offer a more holistic approach to solving these problems. The reality is that we often sit in this spin zone because we're in this treatment model that the medical field has discovered does not work. Treat the symptom, see what happens. Treat the symptom, see what happens. But we often race off and do that on a day-to-day basis. And so when we look at the biopsychosocial model for patient wellness in cybersecurity, there's a more holistic treatment plan that needs more care and feeding than what we're considering on a normal day-to-day basis. Bullet number 3, when we look at biopsychosocial detection and response, is there one that's possible? When we talk about security programs and the role of everyone that's listening today as cybersecurity leaders, our goal is to obviously drive enhancement to the cybersecurity program as well as drive down risk. And when we look at the biopsychosocial aspects of this, it's much bigger. It's a much bigger beast than we give it credit for. And lack of attention in any of those 3 spaces means it's going to heavily influence your cybersecurity program. So the question is there such a thing? And I don't believe we have one today, but I do believe that if we consider treatment plans and we try to identify the best we can in those 3 spaces, that we can have a biopsychosocial detection and response capability. It's called a healthy security program. And it's not an easy thing, and it does require a significant investment. And the 4th bullet point that I've got today that I want to discuss with everyone is, how does AI and ML change the future of cybersecurity wellness across the board? I talked about some of these things cannot be measured and have to be measured at a personal level and managed at a personal level. Some of them in the future may have that ability. And we need to be aware of what types of technology are coming down the pipeline that could possibly help. So to wrap up, What I wanted to talk about is today is obviously the biopsychosocial aspects of cybersecurity. And I believe I've given you all a good case for all of these points. Number one, our cybersecurity patient is way more complex than we give credit. I think we've got a ton of work to do in that regard. In order to win at this game, we might lose a skirmish, but we can't lose the war. And if we are aware of the biopsychosocial aspects of our security program, I believe that we have a better chance of winning across the board. Just like patient wellness, we need to be able to understand cybersecurity disease states and illnesses at multiple levels. And again, I'll go back to societal all the way to molecular. So what's happening at the very base part of your cybersecurity program, from what VMs are you running, what's your hypervisor, all the way to what are you allowing for outside influences into your organization? How are you interacting with third parties, et cetera? Number three, previous experience, right? The patient's previous experience plays a role in how you move forward. So understanding context within a security organization that you walk into is absolutely vital. And lastly, believe that cybersecurity programs are required for proper treatment. When we look at this cybersecurity field, it's just like the medical field. There are specific patient wellness programs that are adhered to in the medical field, and I believe we need to move to those from a security program, health and wellness perspective as well. With that, I've got a ton of references, but open for questions.
You do have a few questions here. The first question is, are you going to make the slides available? We'll put them up on the website if you are. Just somebody wanted to dig into your slides more than they had time to.
Yeah.
So those will be on the website. You can definitely post them in Discord if people need them faster. I don't know what our SLA is going to be on that.
Okay.
We got a lot of things in the air right now. You do have a few questions in chat though, and I actually am not experienced enough in this topic to know whether these are quick questions or like how long it takes. So
Sure.
I can't really order them well for you.
Okay.
But how accepted is integrative medicine in the medical field?
Oh, it's actually a pretty well documented and pretty successful standard of care now. What I would say is you've got, just like any field, you've got practitioners that are leveraging that on a day-to-day basis. You have others that are following, more of a legacy approach. But I think it all depends on, when they went through school and things like that. So when you're looking at this time frame when biopsychosocial started hitting the media and started picking up steam, you're looking at the late 70s, early 80s. And so if people weren't trained in that, you may not see them adhere to it as much. But it is a pretty basic standard of care now. And most doctors, you will see, they are looking and trying to understand total patient. But it's a doctor-to-doctor thing. And so if you're not getting that, all-encompassing care, obviously reach out to another doctor is what my recommendation would be.
I'm going to read this one just like it's written. Hi, Joe. Long-time listener, first-time caller. In the same way we might evaluate a potential spouse for strange diseases or homicidal tendencies, what should be the cybersecurity wellness approach to M&A?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I'll tell you what, mergers and acquisitions are a real tough and challenging space. And part of it is because you might ask for things like, show me that you're compliant with PCI. Okay, so we're going to just talk about that for a second, or show me that you're compliant with ISO. Well, you'll get that standard paperwork from them, that certification normally. But the tough part and the challenging part is that once you dig into the biopsychosocial aspects, actually, I think it's mostly the psychosocial aspects that play a part here. Is you'll find out that those companies' definition of good is not your definition of good. So you'll get the certifications, And one of the most challenging parts in an M&A process is the level of sharing at some point gets cut off as part of due diligence, because you've got tighter time windows, you've got certain things that you're looking at, you've got, obviously there's a social component between the two organizations where the potential M&A opportunity is coming. And so there is a drawing line in which people will share information. And usually it ends, at a paperwork drill. In some cases, you can do more. That's more unique. But the problem is you won't really know how healthy they are until you start integration, until you start looking around the corners and understanding what's the psychology components of this organization. What do they core believe in? What can they actually truly fund? What are they really doing well? And that's the challenge in M&A, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Doctors are focused on patient care, and they might not be, cyber savvy or computer literate or whatever kind of phrase you want to say, that they are well understanding of computer type technologies, right? How do we work with doctors as IT and as patients to educate them on sort of cyber hygiene?
Yeah. Well, so I'll go back a couple of slides here. And this is where I think it's, unfortunate a little bit. So I'll get to that question. Just one thing that I wanted to make sure I pointed out, when we talk about cyber hygiene, usually this biology slide is the only part that's talked about as part of that cyber hygiene. And in fact, usually it's just about, a lot of times when you hear cyber hygiene talked about, it's in the technology space. And you're talking about, well, do my users have laptop X, and are they using secure passwords, and are they doing, XYZ properly from a technology perspective? But there's two other components here, right? So that's the first point I wanted to make. There's the psychology and social aspects that are left out of, cybersecurity. The second part that I'll try and answer the question here. I think if you're working within a hospital, we've got to try and put it in their terms. And the advantages here that you have are, hey, they know what a virus is. They understand what that is. And so if you put it in their terms, you give them a picture of the day in life and what's important to you from a security professional's aspect, I think you're going to win them over. There is basic training and things like that can go a long way. I would say that training can be effective. I think that we'll see, I think most people are probably experienced that cybersecurity awareness training kind of goes on a roller coaster ride, in the sense that there's benefit, but then you see people forget, best practices, and then there's benefit, and then people forget best practices. So I think you've got to walk them through, everything that you do for your standard users. And if you're in a hospital setting, walk them through more. Explain to them the impacts of them taking improper steps across the board, and put it on their terms, not ours.
Speaking of the hospital setting in particular, there's a lot of medical devices and testing gear and tablets for entering your end of day sort of patient care information, and all of these network connected devices. It seems like vendors are sometimes, or perhaps often, going directly to doctors with these sorts of network connected devices. And then the doctors are doing whatever they can to facilitate them to get onto whatever network so that they're connected and can operate. How do we ensure that these devices are tested and sort of, something that should be connected to the networks that they are being connected to?
Yeah, I think, in any space, you've got places of perceived value that people go out and they're interested in new technology. They want to bring them in to the environment. What I would say is lean on potentially existing certifications, if that device has any, if it's been certified in any form whatsoever. I would want to lean on a little bit of third-party expertise if I could, and understand, okay, what due diligence has the company performed? Beyond that, I think you have an opportunity in regards to segmentation. I think that there are risks that you can take by taking segmentation seriously and carving away a portion of the network for potential use or testing use, et cetera. I think this is going to continue to be a challenge. In fact, I see this becoming even a larger challenge as we go forward, just because of the number of IoT devices, the quick connected devices and usage that we'll see across the board. I think those are, and we heard some talks about 5G, right, today. And I think that 5G and IoT are only going to make this a bigger challenge. So we have to, I think, focus more on segmentation as well as lean on some standards for those devices, especially if they have a medical use. Nice glasses, Tim.
That makes sense. Yeah, you might have your own pair. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's sort of a two-pronged question. And when you're at the hospital, I was kind of curious to use segmentation as a mitigation kind of, plan for failure, so to speak, and assume that it's going to happen. Another side effect, I guess, of some of the newer devices is they probably want to be cloud connected in many cases. So how they get to the internet probably doesn't matter, right? As long as they are, they can function. So the vendor's happy, and perhaps it's not compromising anything else at the hospital network.
Yeah, I also think that there are some vendors that have taken some awesome measures in regards to support, and they can do the same thing in security. And one of the things I love is you start seeing some of these major infrastructure vendors, and they are automatically sending detailed logs to their cloud. And they can proactively tell you the health and status of their device. I think more of that needs to occur, especially when you start talking about medical devices. Why aren't those companies responsible for monitoring on a 24/7 basis on top of the monitoring that you're doing? And I think there's definitely more to do in that regard.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there's always a balance of trying to have that be useful and have that utility that the vendor can provide, but also be wary of the sensitive data that might be collected, and have some awareness of what else is actually going up there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, great. I think that wraps up the questions that I found in Discord. If you want to hang around, we're going to have On the Con soon, but we're going to leave Discord open. So if Joe's around in Discord to take more questions, he's tagged with the blue speaker role, and we'll make his slides available, and maybe he will do a little quicker in Discord. So thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Colonel Con team. Appreciate it. I'll be on Discord.
Great. So that actually concludes the technical part of the program for the Bat of Doom track. We'll be around in Discord for a little while. We will leave the server up for quite a while after the conference, so people can connect in other ways, in the ways that they prefer to communicate. But we'll be back with both tracks, both the Terrified Chipmunk and the Bat of Doom, for Own the Con shortly.